Our book of church order, fantastic reading, has actually some specific instructions for me. It says that I'm supposed to preach a sermon suitable for the occasion of ordination. So I will try to be suitable in this sermon this morning. And actually, the topic, I think, works really well because what our passage invites us to think about, I think, is greatness. There was a few weeks ago something that kind of came in the news where Timothy Chalamet did something that is unusual in our day. He earnestly spoke of aspirations for greatness. It was the Screen Actors Guild Award. He was winning the best actor for his portrayal of Bob Dylan. And when he received the award, he said, I know that I'm not supposed to actually pretend that I don't care that much about this. I'm supposed to downplay it. But to do that would be dishonest. And then he went on to say, look, I know we're in a subjective business, but the truth is, I'm really in pursuit of greatness. I know people don't usually talk like that, but I want to be one of the greats. I'm inspired by the greats. I'm inspired by Daniel Day-Lewis, Marlon Brando, Viola Davis, in the same way as I am by Michael Jordan or Michael Phelps. And I want to be up there. That's not normally the way I think people talk in our day. We, I think, see examples of people speaking with that kind of aspiration in other generations. Like, if you remember It's a Wonderful Life, for those of you who've seen this classic film, do you remember when George Bailey is talking to Mary, and he says that he's shaking the dust off this crummy little town off my feet. I'm going to build things. I'm going to build airfields. I'm going to build skyscrapers 100 stories high. I'm going to build bridges a mile long. George speaks in this moment of a desire for greatness. And if you know the movie, you know that the rest of the movie is kind of an exploration of what greatness actually is. It seems to me when I was a kid, that kind of way of thinking and speaking was still acceptable. We were in the day of the space shuttle and the dawning of the computer, where we were encouraged to dream. If we worked hard and we were smart, we could be maybe the next Bill Gates or Steve Jobs. And I remember as a kid, I had aspirations. I wanted to be maybe the next Thomas Edison as an inventor. Or then later, I wanted to be the next Franklin W. Dixon, that great author of the Hardy Boys. I wanted to be, I don't know, maybe great, or maybe just have a life that felt significant. And I'm not sure people feel comfortable as much speaking in that way today. It's better to have kind of a detached aloofness. It was interesting, a lot of social media responded to Chalamet's speech with kind of a verbal eye roll, a cynical irony, because that's how we're supposed to be. But I can't help but wondering if even that is kind of an armor protecting what's actually deeper down. I can't help but wonder if there is something just innately human about a desire for at least some kind of greatness. Now, perhaps you're even saying, well, I don't know about me. I'm not that type A kind of person. Okay, but maybe the word greatness kind of can throw us off. Let's use other language where I think we're talking about the same thing. Isn't it the case that you desire at a deep level to be seen? That you desire for your life to mean something, to be significant? You want, in some way, to be good at what you do, even if that's just being a good parent or spouse or a good friend, or even if you just want to be a good person. And if you're honest, sometimes you feel a little anxious because you're not sure you are. Why is it that many of us have a hard time asking for help? Or many of us have a hard time admitting we're wrong? Isn't it because we want to be a certain kind of person, not a helpless failure? There is a desire within us for our lives to be praiseworthy. So that if someone that we respected were able to look at our whole life from beginning to end and see our decisions clearly, we want them to be able to kind of nod and say, yeah, well done. And in that sense, I want to suggest we all have a kind of desire for greatness. And is that okay? Or is there something sinful? Is it about pride and selfishness that's driving that? Maybe asking the question a different way for this morning. when Mackenzie is ordained later this morning, is it good for him to desire to become a great pastor? Or is that something of pride? Is the desire for greatness something that maybe can be good? And if so, how? It's interesting to me that this question about greatness and what greatness looks like is definitely not a new one. It is very prominent, we see in our passage. The disciples seem to be thinking about it quite a bit. We first notice it in the kind of humorous moment with which our passage begins, where as Jesus and the disciples have been walking through the countryside of Galilee, they finally get to Capernaum. They get most likely into Peter's house, and Jesus, as they sit down, says, "Hey, what were you guys talking about back there?" And suddenly there's just this silence. And kind of like the disciples are kind of like awkwardly looking at each other and maybe a little bit red in the face. And Mark lets us know why. It says in verse 34, "But they kept silent, for on the way they had argued with one another about who was the greatest." I wonder, what would that discussion even have looked like? Jesus did invite me to be one of the three to see Jairus' daughter. Yeah, Peter, but Jesus also did kind of call you Satan. I mean, how would they have compared? Would they have been talking about conversion success ratios? Or maybe who had the total number of demons exorcised? It's kind of a weird thing, right? Although, if we're honest, when we start actually thinking about some of the conversations we have, how often is it when we're casually talking with people where we just happen to mention something that makes us feel pretty proud of ourselves? Or maybe even more darkly, how often do we occasionally say something about someone else that makes us feel better about ourselves in comparison to them? I mean, we do that too. There can be kind of a jockeying for position, and that's what we see going on with the disciples. And not for the last time. In the second part of the passage, you'll notice there's these 5 stars. That's because there's 2 passages that are maybe 30 verses apart from each other that talk about very similar things. And in the second one, we see James and John coming up to Jesus when the rest of the disciples don't seem to be looking, and says, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask you to do." And anyone who's a parent knows this move, right? This is the, "Mom, if I tell you what I want for Christmas, will you give it to me?" It's like, give me a blank check because I know if I tell you what I want, you won't give it to me, but maybe if I can get you to agree ahead of time. And Jesus just, doesn't fall for it. He just says, what is it you want me to do for you? And so what do the disciples then go on and say? They say, "Grant us to sit," this is verse 37 in the second passage, "grant us to sit one at your right hand and one at your left in your glory." This is it again. This is naked ambition. They are close to Jerusalem, and they understand that when they get to Jerusalem, the city of David, that's when Jesus will enter into his greatness, into his glory. Everyone will recognize his importance, is what they think. And they want to be right beside him and share in that importance. It's once again a seizing, an attempt at least to seize greatness. And what's interesting to me about both of these moments is that right after, Jesus stops. Both of these times when there's this jockeying for greatness, Jesus pauses and he gathers them around and decides this is a teaching time. He has something to say about this quest for greatness. What is it? Well, 42 is probably a good place to start. 42 of the second passage, Jesus calls them, and he said to them, "You know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them." This, he says, is the way that the world works. Notice the 2 verbs that he uses has this idea of over, lord it over, exercise authority over. Both the words have this idea of kind of climbing, of getting to a place where you're above others, and so therefore you can look down and have power and authority and prestige over other people. This is how the world generally works, Jesus says. When people are seeking greatness, they do it by climbing. They do it by trying to move up. They do it through comparison. And that hasn't changed. right? We are told today that we live in a meritocracy, and what that means is that I guess you could say, our self-worth is oftentimes connected with achievement. And not just by achievement, but achievement in comparison with others. How do you know if you are successful in whatever your career is? By doing better than others in the same field. How do you know if you are a good parent? Well, it's really hard, but sometimes what we do is we compare ourselves to other parents and we compare our kids to other kids. How do we know that we have standing, that we have status in our society? By doing more, by having more, by belonging to the more important social circles that other people want to get into but can't, by having the nicer car, the nicer house, the nicer clothes. The pathway to greatness in our day, just like it was with Jesus, is generally about climbing, by comparing, by getting above others. And Jesus is blunt in his evaluation of this kind of pursuit of greatness. Verse 43, "But it shall not be so among you. This is not the way for you," Jesus says. The way of climbing in comparison is the wrong way of pursuing greatness because it's not greatness at all. It's a dead end. Do you notice when he speaks in verse 42, he talks about those who are considered? Like, if we were seeing him today, I would imagine Jesus using kind of air quotes, those who are rulers, those who are the great ones. He's saying that is how the world will view this. But that's not really how it is. That's not where greatness is to be found. In fact, the reality is that those people, that climbing, that way of getting to the top that we associate with greatness in the world, Jesus says, actually, in reality, that's slavery. Now, why do I say that? Well, perhaps the most important, or at least one of the most important verses in all of the Gospel of Mark comes at the very end of our passage, where Jesus says something about his mission. He speaks of the Son of Man. If you remember, that is a way that Jesus speaks of himself. For even the Son of Man, he says, came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. As a ransom. What's going on there? Now, in that day, if you ran out of money, if you were in debt that you couldn't repay, you could not just file for bankruptcy and have protection. No, the only thing that you could do if you had a big debt you couldn't repay is you would have to sell yourself and become a slave. And the only way to become free is if that debt is repaid. And this word ransom here, this is speaking of the act of when someone pays off a slave debt so that the one who was once captive can go free. Jesus here is saying, this is what I came to do. I came to pay off the slave debt so that those who are captive can go free. And he's talking about us. And here's what that means. That means Jesus is saying that you and I, apart from him, are slaves. That we have a debt that we can't repay, and so we are captive. The Bible actually speaks about this in a number of places, and it uses different ways of speaking of this. There is this language of a debt of guilt that we have to God. There's this idea of being held captive to death, being a slave of sin. It's all basically talking about the same thing. And whether you've ever spoken in those terms, my guess is all of us at some level have a sense of that problem. That deep down you have this feeling that you're not enough. That you don't do enough. That you have a sense that there is a person that you should be. There's a way that you should live and love, but when you think about your own fears and failures and selfishness, you just feel keenly that you do not measure up. And so there's a sense that you feel a kind of indebtedness, even though you might not be able to articulate what that debt is to. A sense of a need to make things right, even though you don't know to whom you are to make things right with. That's, Jesus says, is captivity. It's the slavery. It's the debt we all have for falling short of the life we've been called to live before God. And when you recognize that, then it becomes clear as you think about it that this climbing, this seeking to achieve, this seeking to define yourself, that isn't what greatness actually is. That's just an expression of the slavery. That is a desire to overcome the void that people feel within them. I mean, does anyone think that this struggle to prove ourselves comes from a place of joy and security and contentment? No, it comes from a place of insecurity. This gnawing sense within us that we're not enough, and so we keep on trying to fix it. We keep on trying to compensate for it. We try to do more and more. We try to make ourselves better than others, hoping that if we do, finally we'll feel that we're enough, and we never are. It's slavery. I mean, think about the greats that our world puts before us. Think of like Jeff Bezos or Donald Trump or Michael Jordan. Are any of those people pictures of joyful, wise, happy, content people? No, it's slavery. And Jesus says, but not so among you. Do not, James and John, you're going down a path that feels like you're moving towards greatness, but it's actually just an aspect of slavery. That is not the way. So what then? What is Jesus saying? When he is saying this, is he saying this whole desire, this longing to be someone that is good and great and to make something of your life, that's wrong. Get rid of it. You need to kind of let go of those desires. Is that what Jesus is saying? Well, surprisingly perhaps, no. Look again at both of the times that Jesus responds to the disciples jockeying for position. So first you see it in 9 verse 35. It says, he sat down and called the 12, and he said to them, if anyone would be first, so in other words, if anyone desires to be first, he must be last and servant of all. Do you see what he's saying here? If you miss it, let me just come back again. When in verse 43 of our second passage, where again he's sat them down and says, but it shall not be so among you, but whoever would be, that is, whoever desires to be great among you, must be your servant. Whoever desires to be first among you must be slave of all. Do you know what Jesus is not saying? Did you notice? He's not saying, whoever desires to be great, stop it. No, he's not saying that there is a wrongness. In fact, later on in Romans 2 will say that part of what is goodness is when we are longing for glory and honor. There is something good about that. He is not saying it is bad to pursue greatness. He's just saying you're pursuing it badly. The greatness that you think you're achieving is the opposite of what you should be doing. You think greatness comes by going up and by climbing over others. But let me tell you, here's what true greatness is. It involves going down and serving others. Right? That's what he says. Whoever would be great among you must be your servant. And then in case we don't understand, he decides to give an illustration. Verse 45, once again, for even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Do you want to know what greatness looks like, Jesus says? Look at the cross when I'm hanging there. When Jesus goes to the cross, he is not forsaking greatness. Yes, he is forsaking glory by the world's standards. He's forsaking status by the world's standards because he really doesn't care about how the world thinks of him. He is not forsaking true greatness. He is accomplishing it. That this is what happens is clear when God the Father renders his verdict by raising Jesus the Son 3 days later. And by doing so, he's saying this, what you have just seen, what he just did on the cross, that is truly great. And Jesus here is saying, if that's what you desire, then join with me. Do you desire to be great? That's good. Do you desire to truly please God? That's good. And let me tell you how to do it, by joining with me in the humble servant love of others. That's what greatness looks like. If you've heard me preach for a while, you'll know that one of my personal heroes, is Fred Rogers. If you ever are feeling like discouraged by the darkness of this world, just Google stories about Fred Rogers and your afternoon will be changed. There are so many different moments that people speak of encounters with him where they still look back with gratitude and feeling seen and cared for. There are a few that I picked up on just yesterday that I loved. Like one, a limo driver who was supposed to pick Mr. Rogers up and bring him back home. And when Fred Rogers found out that they're going to go by the limo driver's home, he said, "Could you just stop there? So I'd love to be able to meet your family." And they spend like the next 2 hours at the limo driver's house where he's just happily playing jazz piano as he's interacting with them. There's another story of how a mom wrote to Fred Rogers about how her blind daughter is worried because she's never able to see the fish being fed. Ever since that point, Fred Rogers, every single time he fed the fish, would tell the camera what he's doing so that blind girl would know that the fish is getting some food. There's another story of a woman whose daughter was going to go through some serious brain surgery, and she contacted Fred Rogers' studio, asking if perhaps he could send an autographed, picture to encourage the daughter. Instead, he called and talked to the daughter for quite a long time, talking about her fears and walking her through some of those. And then after the surgery, he actually came to the hospital and brought his puppets and for hours stayed with the daughter as she was recovering. Now, all of those stories have one thing, I think, especially in common. They're a picture of humble, servant-like love. And I would suggest to you that they are a picture of greatness. Now, the problem, of course, whenever you try using illustrations, is it starts zeroing in on a certain picture, and greatness can actually look very different in different ways. There are ways that there can be a kind of true greatness that looks a little bit like the world thinks that greatness is. For those people with gifts of leadership, they can truly serve and love others in the way they lead. Those who have artistic capacity might be able to serve their community with bringing beauty and joy. Those who have scientific gifts can maybe change the world with invention. But it can also look like those who quietly like to work behind the scenes and take care of others and write people notes. Or those who are just really good at listening. Or greatness can look like someone who regularly prays for people. If you desire a life of greatness, there is one thing in common, and it is that pathway that Jesus shows us of stooping down in servant love. It's the way of the cross. Now, if you are with me right now and thinking about this, perhaps you have two reactions. At least that's probably what I'm feeling when I think about this. One is, I think I agree. That kind of love has a different kind of quality that feels like true greatness in a way that the world oftentimes doesn't get right. And then secondly, you might say, and yet I don't think I can do that. Because we recognize about ourselves that there is a selfishness, there is a fear within us that hinders us from that. And I want to suggest to you that you're right. That you and I cannot live that truly great, God-pleasing life as long as we stay the way we've always been. Because we've already said something about ourselves, and that is by nature, we are slaves. And as long as we are captive, what we're called to, this life of greatness that we might even long for, is out of our reach. There will always be within us that feeling of the need to compensate, to overcome our failures, to prove ourselves, to lift ourselves up. Even when we seek to serve, so often what will be driving us is the desire to please others, to make them happy with us so that we can feel better about ourselves. Or even the simple desire to just kind of have a story where we feel like, yeah, I am a good person. And those drives, though as innocent as they might feel at certain times, will slowly just eat us up until we find ourselves emptied by them. You and I cannot live the life that Jesus is inviting us to live that is truly great as long as we are a slave. But here's the thing. We don't have to be. Again, verse 45. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. He gave his life to pay the debt and set us free. When Jesus is using these words here, he's alluding once again, as he's done multiple times, to Isaiah 53, where in Isaiah there is this servant who gives his life as payment for guilt to make the many righteous. And Jesus here is saying, that's me. I am going to the cross. Again and again he tells his disciples, and again they don't get it. But what he is saying is, I am going to the cross to pay that debt. That debt that you feel, that gnaws at you, that sometimes keeps you up at night, that sense that you are falling short, that sense that you are falling short of the glory that you were meant for, and you don't know how to fix it, and you feel guilt, and you feel overwhelmed. All of that is dealt with. There is no debt. There is no more shame. There is no more penalty, because Jesus gave his life as a ransom for you. I have come, Jesus says, I have come to the cross so that I can set you free. And that means that when we are talking about what we are talking about, there is a certain tragedy in the way that our world naturally is. Do you see it? That all this time, as we keep on intuitively feeling the need to grab, to climb, to get above, every time we are doing that, we're actually keeping ourselves from receiving the very thing we most long for, the thing that we most need. When the real solution, Jesus tells us here, is that we need to let go of any claim to status. We need to let go of self-sufficiency and control. We need, Jesus says, as we saw last week, to become like a child who is helpless. Because it's only when our hands are empty of all of those empty things that we cling on to, only then are they able to take hold of the gift that Jesus has to give us, the ransom that he has paid to set us free. It is only as we learn to be able to say the words of the old hymn that we begin to experience freedom. Nothing in my hand I bring, simply to your cross I cling. And when we eventually come to that childlike, helpless place, we discover something precious, that it's enough, that the cross is enough, that Jesus' ransom payment is enough to satisfy everything. If you have placed your faith in Jesus, if you have received the gift he desires to give you of his life, you don't ever again need to prove yourself, not before God. You don't ever need to undo the way you might have disappointed God in the past. You don't need to turn his anger away. You don't need to somehow make him okay with you. You are his son. You are his daughter. He delights in you because what Jesus has done is enough. And in him, you are free. The debt has been paid, and that means the need for climbing and comparing is over. And what that means also is that the cross doesn't just set us free from our debt. The cross sets us free for greatness. Let me say something that I think I am just in the early stages of beginning to understand more. When you begin to internalize what we're talking about here, about how Jesus has paid the debt completely, about how we are secure, about we need nothing more, when you internalize the fact that I don't need to climb anymore, I don't need to compare anymore, I'm already loved, it's already enough. When that happens, something beautiful begins to happen inside you. You begin to see other people differently. They're no longer people you have to prove yourself to. They're no longer people you have to compare yourself with. They are people that you can see and delight in and love. And as that work takes place in you, as your heart opens towards them, God begins to bring you along the pathway of true greatness. I invite you to join with me now in turning towards God, acknowledging our debt, acknowledging our sin, not so that we just make ourselves feel worse, but so that our hands can be fully open, so that we can receive the good news of God's forgiveness to us in Christ Jesus. Let's take a couple minutes in silent prayer, and then I will lead us in prayer in a moment's time.